So yeah, man, appreciate you jumping on and taking some time, especially on short notice, to be a part of this podcast. What I'd like to do is just kind of start out with a little bit of your story, who you are, what you're about. You know, I know you're from Louisiana. I know you wrote a book.
Hmm.
I know you pastor or you were a pastor for a little bit, and then there's been these seasons of kind of figuring what that looks like. Father of four, and and so yeah, if you just want to kind of kick us off with a little bit of who you are, what you're about, and then we'll just kind of see where that rolls.
Yeah, absolutely. So, born Louisiana, like the bottom of the boot, the hill. I always say. Grew up in a little bitty country town, so that's probably why you hear the accent so heavy. But my parents were present, but they just had a lot of their own baggage, and so they had a lot of, they dealt with some hard drugs that kind of
Mm.
had progressed through the years, and so it created a very dysfunctional family, or a dysfunctional atmosphere in our family, with me and my sister. So I ended up actually moving out when I was 15. I dropped out of school and was house hopping between different family members and different in a different city. And so around this time, I just kind of had the best way I can explain is like this deep encounter with God that kind of projected me into this place of really traveling and teaching and preaching. And so from that, I got into ministry, vocational ministry, where just served with some different organizations, pastor, children's pastor, student pastor, family, and associate throughout the years. And over the years, like I've seen where just where a lot of people in the name of God or Jesus or ministry sacrifice their families for
Mm.
ministry. And I feel like it was a more common thing to do for like a job, just like a normal day-to-day job. But like when I
Yeah,
saw the
yeah.
ministry, I was like, okay, like I don't think this is God's heart. And so that kind of just over the years, just talking to different students and people, and just all these different things that really just kind of increase this. Okay, how can we pour into parents? How can we pour into people who want to be parents, and how can we set them up? So um, that's like a little bit of my story, just kind of like that very dramatic
Yeah,
shift for me at 17 that kind of propelled this whole deal.
that's awesome, man. I love hearing that. And so you currently have four kids.
Mhm.
You guys have been married how long? Like 10 years? Did I
9 years.
9 years, 9 years. So
Hmm.
married 9 years. So you very quickly decided that parenting and pouring into young families was kind of where your heart was at. And that's kind of what drew me to want to talk to you a little bit is I've been thinking a lot lately about parenting and families and what that looks like because we have 8 children. I got two adult kids. I got 6 kids that live at home still, from 14 to 3. And when we first had kids, when my wife and I first had kids, we were absolutely living by default. We were just going with the flow.
Hmm.
None of our kids were planned. Like well, the first two certainly weren't planned. Um, and I was drinking heavily. We weren't married yet when we had our first child. And so like our story is very non-traditional. And my first two kids, I would say, were definitely raised in a very sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of just, we just did what we were told, kind of thing.
Hmm.
They went to public school because that's what you did. They went to preschool because that's what you did.
Hmm.
There's a few things that we made conscious choices of, like we worked opposite shifts so that our kids weren't in daycare. We didn't want to put them in
So good.
daycare. We wanted to raise our kids. But truth be told, we didn't know what raising kids meant, right?
Mm,
And so now, like, I'm really passionate about helping young families and helping parents understand, like, the most important thing you will do with your life if you have a child is raising that kid.
mm. Yeah,
Like,
I agree.
there's nothing else. I don't care what you do at work. I don't care how, like, there is nothing that is more important than how you send those human beings out into the world, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I've found myself in this place where I really am prioritizing being a father. And
Mm,
so, I'm fascinated by people who picked that skill up or understood that calling way sooner,
mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
it took me a minute.
Yeah. Hey, but at least you got it. At least you know you're doing it now. I feel like there's so much that you can really anybody that all they have to do is decide to start and decide to be intentional, and that
Yep.
they can make a huge difference, no matter how much time they feel like they've lost. And we didn't we parent, we call it parenting by default. And it's that parenting by the way that you were parent and the way that kind of just family expects you to parent. And so we actually in our course, like we go through and kind of just helping build it from the inside out, like parents like resisting that temptation to parent the way that their family wants them to parent. And so for us, like it wasn't always like that, but very soon it was. And so we were married. I was 19, she was 17. We were married about a year and a half before our first child, and then our second, they're 13 months apart. Call it Team A. And so with our first child, Emerson, we noticed that it was just kind of that default parenting. Like
Yeah.
we had this, I would say, this very deep, intimate relationship with God, but when it looked like our relationship with God and the relationship with our kids, like it was drastically different. God was very gentle with us, and very or me specifically very gentle with me, and I wasn't very gentle with my child. I would get
Mm.
frustrated and like just these things that wasn't a gentle or intentional parent. And so Allie, my wife, she was actually way ahead of it. She would do the research on like the health part and different things like that. But I remember her coming to me one time and saying, "We're not going to spank." And I'm like, I grew up,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, we were the
Yep.
hood. And,
Yep.
so my mama used to beat the mess out of me. And so like not spank, I was like, it was so foreign to me. I had never seen that
Yeah.
before. And I'm like, okay, but I wanted to be open, because if we felt like God wanted us to do that, then I want to be obedient. And so I remember that the shift happened for me. I had a dream, and in the dream, um, it was like God asking me, "Are you parenting the way that I parent you?" And
Yeah.
like in that moment, like everything shifted, and I said, "Wow." I said, "No." And so starting out, of course, when you tell you have to, because we believe in discipline, so it makes it when you can't just like lash out and spank, which we had promised from the very beginning that we wouldn't spank our children out of anger. And
Yeah.
so when we decided to do that, then and wait until like our emotions pass before we spank, like we realized we don't spank like that. We never did spank unless it was in anger. And so this discipline thing, like when we would discipline our kids, like it would be very intentional. We would pretty much stop any conversation that was going on, and like we would get down to their level and
Yep.
talk wherever they were at. And so just little things like that.
Yeah.
As far as being intentional, we didn't get it right off the bat. Now we have two kids that our third, he's like he doesn't know any of that. And so it's
Yeah.
been very cool to see how just the development process with him, because he's 3. But like you could tell so much more different from the when Emerson and Zion was younger, which Zion was like kind of like on the tail end. He was right in the middle of the transition. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. I know our first two kids, Carrie never spanked any of them. And it reminds me of like this conversation we have often about reaction versus a response, right? Like you said, like if
Yeah.
you wait to think through how you want to discipline your child, and then you go to spank them because you think that's the proper discipline, you
Hmm.
don't spank them because that's not really a healthy response, right?
Hmm.
Like, and when you put it through the lens of how my heavenly Father treats me,
Hmm.
then yes, it's definitely a misaligned response, right? And so I always think about like how do we react? Because for me, the times that when we before we chose not to physically discipline our kids, I would spank them, and or they'd get a smack on the butt, or they get smacked in the back of the head, like, "Hey, get your act together."
Mm,
That was always a reaction. It wasn't a response, like I'm thinking it through. Because,
mm,
like you said, like if you can get down on their level and talk to them and meet them where they're at, like you can really have a much greater impact. And I
yeah.
read something a few years back that really struck me about how we react to our children's behavior through the lens that we have or we would have had at that same age,
That's
right?
good.
So like when my 14-year-old behaves a certain way, I tend to get frustrated because I feel like they're entitled. I feel like they have this sense of entitlement. But the reality is just that I grew up poor and we didn't have video games. We didn't have color television. Like we didn't have a
Yeah,
color
it's
TV,
completely different generation.
and color TVs existed. It wasn't like I'm not that old. It was just we just didn't own one.
Yeah.
Like so when I hear my son talk about some of the struggles that he has, I'm thinking about it like, man, when I was 14, I didn't have leather Chuck Taylors. I didn't have an Xbox. I didn't have a desk in my own. And when I read that article and was processing that information, I was like, man, if I try to flip back to like what he's experiencing, not what I
Hmm.
experienced, but what he's
Yeah.
experiencing, I have no concept of what it's like to be a 14-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 10-year-old in 2021.
Yeah.
The access to information, the internet, streaming
Hmm.
television, the amount of content that's out there. And kids are
Yeah.
sponges, man. So it's
Yeah.
hard. And I think for Carrie and I, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, because for Carrie and I, we set out to be different parents, but it
Hmm.
was never modeled for us. So we didn't even know how. And then you couple that with you got to make money to
Hmm.
live. You got to pay the rent, you got to buy the food, you got to pay the gas bill. And so often we would set out the day with a good intention, but then like the realities of our commitments to work or other things would supersede those like long-term decisions with our kids, right?
Yeah.
And so like I know you and Allie both work from home,
Hmm.
have like sort of that privilege because I think I look at my situation with Carrie and I both being from home. There's a little bit of privilege there that I can say like I'm home all day with my kids if I
Yeah.
choose. I don't have to
Yeah.
go to work. Now we could make more money if I chose to get a job, like a
Yeah.
traditional job, but I choose not to, so I can be home with my kids. And like, and some would say, well, that's a sacrifice you're making. I'm like, I don't see it that way. I see it as like that's a privilege I have. That's a blessing I have that I
Yeah.
get to make that choice. So how do you or like encourage, I guess, parents who are working, dual income, 9 to 5 jobs, raising kids to
Yeah.
maintain that level of energy it takes to be intentional?
Yeah. What we do, and this is one of the things that we actually do in our, I call it the if group. Allie always last name, but it's our intentional family group. And I believe that anybody, if you desire to be intentional, like whether you work a 9 to 5, 9 to 7, whatever, there's some hacks that you can do. And so it may look like just sitting down for 5 minutes, even though you're exhausted, but 5 minutes and just give your undivided attention to your child. It may look like, creating 30 minutes for yourself to kind of dive deep into your mind of why you react every time this
Mhm.
certain thing happens, or why you can't feel like you can get to this habit. And so that's kind of like that's really what we go. But I really think, or that's what we teach, and what we instill in really anybody we talk to. But I believe it comes down to a point of what kind of culture do you want to create? Because one of the things, that anybody have, whether you're in the workplace or just in general, it's or especially when you just get married, it's these two opposing cultures that clash. And so what happens is, for example, for marriage, like you're learning somebody's internal world. They have a whole life before you, and so you're learning these things. And a lot of times, like there would be these clashes, and like it manifests itself as, oh, you put the toilet paper the wrong way, or oh, like you keep putting your clothes right there, in these little bitty things. But it's like deciding yourself, if you're a single parent, or with your partner, if you're a parent. But like, what kind of culture do we want to create? And so do we want a culture that's intentional? Do we want a culture where our kids see that, okay, family is important, family is the highest thing, or the highest priority, beyond making money, or beyond hanging out with other people, or beyond like all these like extravagant things, or whatever the case might be. Like, what kind of culture do you want to set in your home, and then working from there? And for some people, that may, they may have that intention, they may have that desire, but they're in, they're in this system that they want to do that, but they don't know how to make a living with, and that's perfectly fine. Start with where you're at, but keep that vision in mind. And so that's kind of, we really kind of like dive in, because there's so much that goes into, like, with the individual person, and what you were saying, what you're hinting to with the react and responding. A lot of times it's getting that out the way, which is,
Yeah.
it's harder when you're working 60-70 hours a week. But like doing that work and saying, okay, like, who am I? Like, why do I act this way? Like, I don't want this thing to be. And like, when parents do that, when partners, when spouses, when they do that, then what happens is, because we could tell you could tell your kids so much stuff, but a lot of times, like, the culture that they adapt, or that they grow into between 5 and 7 years of age, like, it's all caught. You heard the say, parenting is caught, not taught. And
Yeah.
so they're watching your habits, they're watching how you respond to situations, they're watching how you respond to pressures of life, they're watching how you talk to your spouse, or talk to their siblings, or talk to them. Like, they're watching that, and they're picking up on that. And
Yeah.
so, really, for us, it's that creating that culture. And one of the big things that we teach people, and that we really hold ourselves to standard, is communicating. Communicating our emotions. So we might be mad in a moment, and we might flash out, and we have those times. But by the end of the day, like, we're apologizing for that outburst. We're
Yeah.
talking through, like, hey, I was actually dealing with this. And from really, when we started, when our kids were real little, like, we were having conversations with them like they were grown. And so
Yep.
now,
Yeah.
our oldest, like, she'll say, hey, like, that you really made me feel that way. And she communicate on the level that a lot of adults that I've seen,
Yeah.
over the years, don't
It's
even communicate that.
it's crazy to me. I mean, we homeschool, and I know you guys homeschool too. So I want to kind of unpack that a little bit. But the number of times people tell me, like, your kids are able to have a conversation with adults like a lot of kids their age can't. And it took me a while to figure out why that was, or what was different, because I always kind of looked at it like they're just our kids. I didn't
Mhm.
understand the conversation we were having. And then I realized it's like, our how we've never baby talked. We've never, like, there isn't a conversation or a topic in our house that's off limits. Now, I may
So good.
respond differently to my 14-year-old than I do to my 5-year-old if they
Hmm.
ask the same question, but it's never like, well, you're not old enough to understand that. You're not old enough to, like, we will have those conversations with them. And I think because they have older siblings, also, they're always observing all of that, right? And so, I love how you talk about, like, the emotional intelligence of your kids, because you're going to them and you're communicating how you feel, and you're expressing to them how important it is. Because I think a lot of parents, they're afraid to be honest with their kids and be like, I don't know
Hmm.
what the hell I'm doing. Like,
Yeah.
there are times I've, like, Carrie and I, we have the six that live in our house now, and we have a 23-year-old and a 21-year-old. Well, there are things that my now 14 and 12-year-olds are experiencing that you would think, because they're our third and fourth kid, well, we've already been down that road.
Hmm.
But the age gap and just the cultural differences, it's like, I know you're 14 and you're the third kid in the line, or you're the fifth kid or the sixth kid in the line. I've never experienced this, and I
Yeah.
really don't know what I'm doing. So we're gonna have to figure
Yeah.
this together. And that means that you look at me as your dad and as the leader, but I'm gonna probably fail. And
Hmm.
you gotta walk with me in that. And we gotta figure this out.
Yeah.
I think a lot of parents try to take that stance of, like, I'm the parent, you're the kid.
Mm,
I'm gonna tell you what's up. You're gonna listen. And it's like, that's cool, but 9 times out of 10, you're not gonna get it right. And you got to be comfortable
mm-hmm.
back to your kid and being like, my bad. Like,
Yeah.
and recognizing like the humanity in us. Like, I love my son, but there are times that I've lashed out at him
Mm-hmm.
about things or I've overreacted to something he's done. And I've had to go back to him and say, hey, man, what you did was out of line. But my response was over the line as well, because I was actually angry about these other 7 things that
Mm,
happened and not this one. Right.
yeah.
And what I've seen is, and within our kids over time, like I would go to him and apologize, and he would be like, whatever. And he would have an attitude or he'd still be angry. Now, if I go to him and apologize, he's like, yeah, we're good, because he's already recognized that,
That's so
like,
good.
my response or my reaction to him wasn't about him. He's been
Yeah.
able to learn that, like, most people's stuff, that's their stuff. That's not about me. That's about what
Yeah.
he's going through. And
Which
so
is
I
so
love
good
you.
because you explain your emotions that when we take the time to like express ourselves and express what we're feeling, and then even process I'm thinking like it creates this emotional intelligence in our kids. So now they can relate
Yep.
like, okay, daddy was mad, mommy was mad about that, and this was happening. And so they start to they start to conceptualize these things at a very young age when we take the time and when we express
Yep.
ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
For me, a lot of it's
that's
about
really awesome.
it is, and it's about modeling that behavior. Like, we've had open conversations with my daughters that, like, I am on a mission to make it
Mhm.
hard for them to find a husband,
Yeah.
because I'm gonna love their mom in a way that they deserve to be loved.
Mm.
And like, we've had the conversation, like, as our daughters are starting to get older, about, like, I hope it's hard for them to find a good spouse, because I want to set the bar high for them. I want them to
Yeah.
know. Like, and I've had people ask me sometimes, they're like, how do you and your wife get through stuff? And it's like, well, first, it's not how, it's why. And it's because we're
That's good.
committed,
Yeah.
right? And you talked about it, you talked about, like, the communication,
Mhm.
like, in all of the successful and intentional things that I've seen bring, like, to fruition, communication has been like one of the underlying tenets, right? So, like,
Mhm.
how do you guys go through, or like, what are some hacks that you have, like, in your intentional parenting group, or intentional family group, that help people communicate? Because I think there are a lot of families out there, are a lot of parents, husbands and wives, who really lack the ability to communicate.
Yeah. I think one of the things communicating healthy because everybody, you're going to
Sure.
communicate regardless. It just might not be in a healthy way. It might be in a certain thing that you do. Like when you get mad and like you just shut down or you get mad and clean up or like some little nuance. And so what we do, we talk about identify or one of the primary things that we do we talk about identifying triggers or identifying childhood traumas that you might have experienced that just kind of made you not be able to communicate or process emotions a certain way and just flash and lash out. And so we talk about that a lot for communicating. But even the thing with uh, Allie and I, we realized that the way that we communicate, what you were just hinting to, which is so awesome, the way that we communicate to each other is setting the bar for our children. And so we believe that the same standard that we hold ourselves to, we hold or the same standard that we talk about and hold our children to, we hold ourselves to, and we communicate. And so it may look like you know depending on where we're at or what we're dealing with, it may look like, okay, I can't have this conversation with you right now because emotionally, like I need to process some stuff, or mentally, like I have all this stuff that I need to figure out. So we're going to have to pause on this relationship and or pause on this communication and then resume it at another time. And so that's the traumas and triggers. And then really, once you kind of do that, like in the same vein, it's knowing, just really knowing yourself a little bit more. So I mean, one of the biggest things we do, is like getting down and like, okay, who are you? Who are you? Like, why do you do what you do? Like, what how does your inner world work? And like, we really challenge people to dig deep into that, and how they process information, emotionally. And then, another thing that we do is that we believe, because I would say we're people of faith, like we believe like in a holistic, uh, approach. And so we don't just tackle things at a physical or mental or emotional level. We have that spiritual aspect too. And so even though it's simple, but it's complex in nature, like we take that into consideration when we're communicating with our kids, or to others, or to ourselves. And so, just kind of, we might not be able to have certain conversations around certain people or in certain environments. And so another little quick, tip is like making sure the atmosphere, the environment, the context is set to even have this conversation.
Yeah.
You know, because there might be some things that I'm not going to talk about around your mom.
Right.
I'm just not going to do that. So hey,
Yeah.
like, don't talk to me about those situations. And then it's really, to sum all that up, it's really like overly communicating. And so we get some things like, or me, I like challenging myself in this manner of like, okay, and really, I feel like God has really kind of challenged me, because he's so, I felt him, tell me to apologize when I didn't think I was wrong. And so like, okay, go apologize, whether it's to Allie or to other people. I'm like, I didn't do anything though. Like, wow. And
Yep.
so this thing of like overly, or he was training me to like overly communicate. And so now, like, it's like, okay, like, hey, like, I really don't want to talk about that right now. Or, hey, like, let's talk about this. Like, when is a good time? And just like overly communicating, to the other person, or even to our kids, or any kind of relationship,
Yeah.
really.
That's so good. And it was such a hard lesson for me to learn because I grew up in a house, we talk about like we repeat the sins of our fathers, whether we
Yeah.
want to or not, unless we actively go seek different behaviors because if that's what was modeled for us. And so we can say all
Mm-hmm.
we want, I don't want to be like my dad, or I don't want to be like my mom, or I don't want to, but unless you actively go find other methodologies, you're gonna repeat that because that's just
Yep.
what you know. And early on in our marriage, I mean, Carrie and I have been together 25 years. And early on in our marriage, probably until about 7 years ago, um, I would force conversations because she would take after her mother and would kind of shut down and not talk.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go the opposite direction, be like, we have to talk about this. And I would push so hard that she didn't feel like there was a safe space to talk about it because I
Yeah.
would get angrier and angrier the longer it took for her to open up. And I finally realized that like there has to be a space. You have to be in the like there has to be a framework to have that conversation. And
Mm-hmm.
because she was coming from a place of like not knowing how to express herself or having fear around expressing herself, that I was only going to get little bits and pieces at a time until she felt safe. And then she would tell me more, and then she would tell me more. And
Mm.
even now, at our 25th year into our relationship, we've been married 23 years. She'll sit me down and be like, I need to talk to you about something, and tell me
Oh,
something from
wow.
10 years ago that
Wow.
she's just gotten to a place that she feels safe sharing it. And I'm the opposite. Like you could ask me anything and I'll just tell you. And you could be off the
Yeah.
street. And I'm like, I don't care. I'm an open book. Like he knows
Yeah.
everything. So you might as well know it
Yeah.
too. And we're just so different that way. But it took me
Yeah.
forever to learn that sometimes you can table the conversation, you can communicate about it later and still get results. And it's such a it's such a skill to learn. Even like today, we sat down to do something that needs to be done. It's kind of got a time, it's time sensitive, and something happened that triggered her, like you said, like there was a trigger. and she immediately got angry about something. And so she fixed that or whatever and came back, sat down, and I had moved on. I was like, we're not going to have this, we're not going to do this thing with you in that mood. And she was like, well, are we going to do it or not? And I was like, well, we'll do it, but you need to be in the right headspace and you're not
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
In the past, I would have just been like, we're on a schedule. We got to get it done. We're going to do it right now. And it
Yeah.
would have turned into a fight. And it takes time. And I wonder from a outside the parenting thing, but from like a relationship standpoint, do you see, do you feel like parents or couples understand like the amount of time they're going to be together? Because I feel like a lot of couples are trying to like solve everything right away. And it's like, man, if you're committed to a lifelong relationship, some of this stuff takes years to figure out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I believe that, we're always going to have these obstacles. We're always going to have these challenges in relationships, whether it's our spouse or our kids. But I believe principles translate. And
Okay.
so, one of the things with growing with somebody is they're going to change. And it's really a privilege when you're in the committed relationship, and that's one of the I believe one of the reasons that marriage is the way to go is because we're committed, so we're gonna work through it. uh but like you're growing, hopefully, in like this weird way that's all over the place, but also you're connected with somebody that's also hopefully growing. And as you're growing, it's these relational dynamics that you may change every 10 years or whatever the case might be, but being able to communicate, essential, and be able to realize, like just what you were saying, like the long term.
Yeah.
So what if I respond this way, like how is that going to affect long term? um and when I feel like, and that's just like a principle, I feel like when we take that kind of mindset, then it's like, oh, okay, then if I live, or let me put it this way, God had just asked me this question at this retreat: are you living in the past, or are you living from the future?
Mm.
And so, like, a lot of times, like, our past hurts or thing, we get caught up in this loop, negative or positive, whatever the case might be. But we get caught up in this loop of like, okay, you're just responding because of these past programs or these past experiences that you have, rather than living from the future. Our eyes are on the front of our face for like a reason. We see
Yeah.
forward, and the way that God intended for us to live is from vision, from the inside out, from this higher reality, the whatever you want to call it. But it's so having a vision, a long-term vision, like, okay, like I'm going to be with my spouse until forever. So this is a very important
Yeah.
relationship. Okay, so how do I handle that relationship dynamically? And what I've learned over the years, and obviously still learning, is that when I approach it from that kind of perspective, then it helps me get through those challenging things, or even kind of like hold off on some things that I really want to go into, or I really want to push, because I know that the time will come, or I know that there will be a better time than right then to talk about it. And
Yeah.
same thing, kind of shifting into like the relation with our kids, knowing that one of the things for me is it's kind of like this sober reality, but my kids aren't my kids. you know
Yep.
I believe that we're here to help guide them on the way that God wants for them. So like how so it leaves for each child a very unique, because I mean they are their own person. And if we just try to take what we taught this child onto this child, then
Yeah.
it could be very damaging long term. you know and
Yeah.
so it really takes, like, okay, I thought I knew you, but and this worked for you, Emerson, but this isn't going to work for you, Zion. Or this
Yeah.
I see that you're your own different person, you have these own things. And so relationally, attacking it like, um okay, you're your own person, so I'm going to have to shift, or how does this principle apply to that relationship?
Yeah.
um
It's so
that's
good. It's you raise this really interesting point. Two of them really, because I think about like you guys getting married at 19 and 17, and you talk about like how you grow and you change as people. Like,
Mhm.
I mean, scientifically we know like our brains aren't even fully formed till we're like 25, right?
Mm-hmm.
Carrie and I were married at she was 19, I was 23. So we're both in similar situations in that like, man, the first 10 years of our marriage, we're still figuring out who we are as people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And now you're in this committed relationship. And for I think for both of us, like with children, right? And so
Yeah.
it's like, man, like how does that Venn diagram work of like figuring out who I am, figuring out how to raise other people, and giving my spouse the space to figure out who she is, but also wanting to have a thing together. Like people, I did this podcast the other day about marriage and how I don't really think, and I know I didn't give this much as much thought as I do with hindsight, but I don't know that people really understand the complexity of marriage and
Mm-hmm.
like the enormity and the length of time. Like I've been with my wife for now more than half of her life, and
Wow.
we'll go another 20, 30 years, God willing. And so for the vast majority of her lifetime, we will be partners, and same for me. Um, and so I'm fascinated by like how much people like just jump into like marriage or what that looks like. And then, oh, what was the other thing you said that I don't remember? It escapes me.
Yeah.
But there was another point that you made, and it'll come back or it won't.
Yeah. No, I think it's the complexity when you commit to somebody, like that's a big deal. Like I'm very thankful because I didn't. My parents were both in my life, but they weren't in their right mind type deal. And just their connection brought like this highly dysfunction. So like I seen that, and they even said multiple times it probably would have been better for them to, or at least for a healthier atmosphere for them to be separated. But there was something in that, just like, okay, like sticking it out, whether whatever create, there's something about like that sticking it out like through all these different seasons that was ingrained in me, that said, okay, like if they could do it, then we could do it. But also this thing of the complexity is, especially when you put in westernized culture, because we move we move way faster than a lot
Yeah.
of other parts of the world. And then you do in like childhood trauma, childhood, or the abuse, you throw in, okay, now you got some kids, now you got like this whole identity shift every 7 to 10 years type deal. And one of the things that I'm really thankful for personally, that I felt uh, that has helped me navigate like a lot of just kind of being able to function with my family, but also uh, realize like the trauma from sexual abuse that I experienced when I was a child. Like these things, like one of the things that I hold in high regard is my relationship with God, because what happened was I was able to in a sense get outside of my body. And so I was able to, from that relationship, I was able to see like, okay, Patrick, the reason why you respond this way is because this happened to you,
Hmm.
or the reason why you don't respond this way is because you've never been exposed to that level of communication, or that level of relationship. Or And so these things of, I think it's so important, especially when raising a family and going through and being intentional in your personal growth and the growth with your spouse, is this thing of like, get to be able to get outside of your body
Yeah.
and see like, okay, and reconceptualize, which is a very, very, I mean, you have some way more qualified people to talk about on your podcast. But like this thing of getting outside your body and be able to put the pieces together. And so it's this thing of like being able to come out, which a lot of times when we're fast paced, and when we're stuck in like this loop from trauma that we haven't handled or confronted,
Yeah.
we can't do that. We can't reconceptualize. So I would say it in this way: the enemy takes that part of us that God intended for us to be able to change and shift and live with harmony with other people, and be in peace and joy and these different things. When we are, going back, it's more simply put, it's our external world dominating our internal world or our internal culture. And
Yeah.
I believe that God created us to live the other way around, like from the inside. And so no
Yeah.
matter if I can't pay this bill, or no matter if this crazy situation just happened right in front of me at the store, or this, I don't know what's happening with you, you're going through your own stuff, like it's crazy and it's making me frazzled. That should never be able to dictate me as much as my internal world dictates me.
Yeah.
So
So
I
good.
can draw peace, I can draw joy, I can draw love, I can draw kindness,
Yeah.
and I'm not dictated by the outside culture. I'm dictated from this internal relationship between me and God. And so one of the things with bringing that into relationship and the complexity that I'm so thankful for is that it's been, for me, going through those kind of growth things, it's been like, okay, like Patrick, like you're really like this is getting to you, you know. Uh okay, so talk with me, or let me go on like my quiet time or whatever, talk that out and not take that out on my family, you
Yeah.
know. And so just, yeah, sometimes it happens, but like limiting those uh reactions, and
Yeah.
just growing and then cleaning up your mess if you do it, and
Yeah.
not
I
like
think there's, I think
letting ego
there's,
get you.
yeah. I mean, ego is definitely the thing, like prideful, right? Like you don't want to admit
Hmm.
you don't want to admit you made mistakes. I think the ability to sort of recognize unhealthy behavior,
Yeah.
and the faster you can recognize it, the better. That way you can identify what those triggers are. Um, and then I love what you said about like the internal versus external fight, because our culture moves so fast. I heard this quote this morning that like I had to stop and think about. I was at the gym and I sat there like pondering this quote. And I'm supposed like, it's the gym's busy. People are like waiting on a machine. I'm like sitting there going, what did that dude just say? Hold on, let me
Yeah.
rewind. But he said fast thinking is the enemy of an advanced civilization. And it
Mm,
just it, and they were talking specifically about like how we have so much content, we have so much noise, the Twitterverse, the Facebook, the headlines, people aren't reading in depth, they're not critically thinking, and they're not really unpacking. And they were talking a lot about like how there's this polarization in politics and anything we talk about anymore, right? Because I'm sure that
mhm.
there's parents listening right now who are just like, I don't have time to be intentional. Or I said intention, but it just gets away from me because I got soccer and school and work and this and that and this and that. And like I get that. But um it was such a powerful thing to think about, like we gotta stop just skimming the headlines and like of our kids' lives and like
Mhm.
really dig down and go, okay, talk to me about this, talk to me about that. And if your kid's giving you attitude or if they're not wanting to express themselves, like recognizing that that's not because they don't like you or that's not because they don't want to talk about it. It may be because they don't know how to talk about it.
Yeah.
You gotta peel that onion back over and over and over again till you get to like the root cause of that, which reminded me what I was trying to remember earlier was you talked about how like your kids aren't yours. And I think this is another challenge. And I'm wondering what your experience is with this, because I see a lot of parents living vicariously through their kids. Like they do things or they have their kids involved in things. Maybe their kids don't want to even be involved in, whether it's
Mhm.
like the trope about it would be like sports, right? Like my dad played
Mhm.
football, so I got to play football, or my dad was an attorney, so I got to be an attorney. And then you find out like dude doesn't want to be an attorney. He wants to be an artist or like an
Yeah.
actor, or my dad was like whatever that case may be. But like this idea that like my kids, right, we're possessive of them.
Mhm.
But the reality is that I'm their father.
Yeah.
Like, and it's more accurate to say that my job here is not to own them or control them, but to the word I've always liked is steward. Like I'm kind of just
Yeah.
here to
So good.
steward them on their path, keep them safe to a point where, they've got the skills needed to kind of self-actualize, right? Like
Yeah.
become what they were meant to be. And
Yeah.
when I shifted my mindset around that, I found like my ego took a hit because it's
Yeah.
like you want to be in control. It's like I want a football
Yep.
star, I want a whatever, whatever.
Yep.
But I found that like I was so much more at peace sometimes with their journey when I realized it's not a reflection of me.
Hmm.
It's actually the opposite, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um,
I think, two things. I believe any parent, and this is why we kind of we try to gather people that has that same intentional desire, not necessarily that their lifestyle can be as intentional as us, because you're on your own journey, like it's going to look different. But like if you have that desire, then we can work together. And it goes back to attention is energy. So being able to pinpoint, or being able just to create enough space for your child to know that when they get upset, like they respond this way, and then being able to confront that in a healthy way that builds on long-term relationship is so key. Because that 9 times out of 10, when they get 13, like it's going to change, it's going to shift. But when if you establish that connection point, if you gave that energy right there, even if you had the 18-hour shift, but if you just over time, like those 5 minutes, creating those safe spaces like you mentioned earlier for them to communicate, then long term, it's going to be a huge win. And so,
yeah,
for that part, just giving attention, just creating that space, and just, hey, like, being honest, like, I don't really know, I don't know how to respond to this, or how to act like that. But that's kind of that's the nature of it. uh and letting them into the process of that, which I think is one of the key things as far as these spiritual progressions, because we could raise kids that, they're prim and proper. You teach them how to shake hands, you teach them how to talk to people, and whatever the case might be. But spiritually, if they aren't built up, then what happens is they're going to get into the world, and they're just going to adapt to whatever spirit, whatever is that energy that's in that job. And so they're not going to be, which it goes back to the type of culture that you want to raise. For us, we believe in a culture of impact. So we want to raise
100%.
our kids to be impactful, in the sense of, when they go into an environment, they leave it better than what it was.
Yeah.
And so that looks like, school, for a lot of times, and which I love that you guys did for the daycare. One of the things that we don't take into consideration, in parenting, is the spiritual atmosphere of our kids and what they're exposed to. So, one practical example, without getting too deep, there's some movies, okay, we won't let our kids watch, but like, we will let our kids watch a PG-13 movie, uh, especially like we feel like God, because we believe exposing them to certain things that sparks this question, or this conversation, or even
Yeah.
this intentional way of thought. So we don't shy away from those things. Like, okay, mommy, like, why are they doing this? Or, what's that word? Like, for example, one of the Black Panther. We love Marvel movies, and so I remember one time, we were watching Black Panther, and then there was one time, or is this part where the the sister like flicks off Black Panther, and like, we don't flick each other off, uh,
Yeah.
but not that anything's wrong with that, but the spirit behind it could be very wrong. And so I remember Emerson like holding up her fingers, like, oh, what's that? Like, oh, I was like, oh, well, that's this, and some people use it for this, uh, and so being able to pinpoint, like, just like we would call out emotions, is
Yep.
is one of the big things that we are identifying emotions, is one of the big things that we teach our parents, and people that want to live that intentional life, like pinpointing the spirit, like, hey, like, they weren't, like, that was hateful, or that
Yeah.
wasn't right that they did that. And so bringing that spiritual aspect into this thing, it changes things.
So
So
important.
our kids aren't going to go to school unless we feel like it's time for them to go and make an impact. But they're going to be so built up from the inside out that they'll step into a place and shift it, and not be able to be molded or taken advantage of in
Yeah.
that sense.
Yeah, it's so good. We've had this conversation with our girls quite a few times, especially the younger ones, because they'll do something that hurts somebody else's feelings or creates some tension. And then as we
Hmm.
start to unpack what happened, like what they did wasn't necessarily wrong. But what I always ask them is like, what was your intention? Where was your heart at when you said that?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but the person who received it knew that you weren't coming with a happy heart. Like you
Yeah.
were intending something, you were being unkind, right? Because it's
Hmm.
like, well, yeah, I get it. It's not, it wasn't wrong, but your intention behind it was not to bring peace and love.
Yeah.
It was to stir
Yeah.
the pot or mix something up.
Yep.
And so yes, you didn't do anything wrong, but where was your heart at? So I love that conversation. Um,
Which goes
and,
back to
and
that communication part and calling it out. Even if you're,
yeah,
only 51% sure, but when we call it out, when we identify it, it creates something inside of our mind, inside of our child's mind, that says that identify. It's just like kind of like training a dog or anything,
yep,
with the clicker or whatever. You're associating this clicker with really any animal. You're associating this noise with a certain reward, and so where that action is, like, they identify with it. Same
yeah.
thing is calling out, even if you don't know, just addressing it and bringing it up, bringing it outside into conversation so that they could start to see,
Yeah,
and like you said earlier, actualize like what that is. And over time, even if you don't know yourself, over time, what happens is you may begin to know, like, okay, like I see where the two connect, but also your
yeah,
child gets to see like where the two meet up, or where
yeah.
the pieces of puzzle connect.
Well, and they start calling each other out. They start to be like, "Hey, that wasn't cool. Well, I didn't do anything wrong." And it's like, "Well, where was your heart at?" And they're like,
Mm,
"Oh." It's like when you got 12-year-olds asking each other where their intentions are, where their
yeah,
hearts,
that's
like, and which is funny because, like, I mean, I've had conversations with my kids where we've educated them on something, or we've tried to impart some sort of ideology or thought process into them. And then weeks or months go by and I'll make a mistake or I'll like kind of slip, and they have no problem coming to us and saying, "Hey, where was your heart?" Or what
yeah.
was this? And like it's like, wow, okay, so one, you're listening, and two, you're actually using that in the right context. Like you're actually bringing that to the conversation in the right way, which for me is like it's a huge part of the reason why. And I love what you said about letting them watch movies that are maybe old, because like Emerson's what, like 8, 9,
7.
7. Okay, so Emerson's
Hmm.
7, watching PG-13, which some people would look at and go, well, that's we're not we don't
Yeah.
do. But like I'm in the same boat as you. Like I know that my kids are going to be exposed to things that I don't necessarily want them to be exposed to,
Hmm.
but I'm gonna get to control that. Like
Yeah.
that's the world that we live in. So for me, I would much rather have them exposed to it in my presence, have them ask me the
Hmm.
questions so that I can communicate to them, and it develops that space so that when they're 15, 16, 17, and they're being exposed to really adult things that maybe could be very harmful to them, we have already established that we can have open, honest conversation about it without shame, without judgment. And it's just like, okay, here's what this is. Because my biggest fear was like my parents were very much unavailable. And so if like I had my first drink at 16 and I was an alcoholic by the time I was 18.
Mm.
And
Well.
that was because I couldn't go talk to my parent. When I had my first drink, I didn't have a pathway with them to be open and honest and say, "Hey, I was at a party and this is what happened," and to have them guide me in that way. It was I had to figure it out on my own. And I
Yeah.
just don't have the framework at 16, 17 to figure that out. And so with our kids, we're very much the same way where like my oldest boy was exposed to pornography at 7 years old.
Mm, yeah.
and, at school. And it was like,
Yeah.
well, okay, let's unpack that. So now it's like we have these open conversations about anything. If they can ask the question, they're ready for a response. Is like
Hmm.
kind of the way I view it. Now, like I
Yeah.
said,
No, that's
my
good. That's really,
2-year-old
really
is
good.
gonna get a way more detailed response about sex than my 5-year-old, right?
Yeah.
Like you got to know your audience and you got to cater their, but I'm not going to tell my 5-year-old, oh, you just figure that out when you get older, because something has already been presented to her that would
Hmm.
cause her to ask the question.
Yeah.
So I don't want to push that off like, oh, dad doesn't talk about that.
Yeah.
Like, nope, we talk about it and we're open about
Yeah.
it. There's no shame in it. And
Yeah.
I think it's so important because I feel like a lot of parents, like I know for me and my wife, neither one of us had those conversations with our parent. Like when my dad
Yeah.
sat down to have like the birds and the bees talks, I was like,
Uh-huh.
bro, we're so far past that conversation. Like there ain't nothing to be tell me. Like I'm sure you probably
Yeah.
have similar,
Yeah.
you know.
And I think one of the things that I think it goes to is when we're just going and we're not living intentionally, because we don't desire to, or because we just have so much junk in our lives that's just piling up that we haven't stopped and been still to address. Then what happens is we just, oh, we just push off those questions. And one of the things that happens when any kind of relationship, when you don't invest time in it, over time it's gonna separate it. It's not gonna be the highest quality that it can be if you were to invest your time, invest your attention, your energy into those questions. So we take the same approach as far as, like, okay, what questions are you asking? And, like, just because of the way that we set up, we're very privileged of being able to go a little bit deeper
Yeah.
into those conversations, without sacrificing time for other things. And that's one of our things. We just believe that is important. And another thing I feel like is so important when we do that is, I call it the law of first impression.
Okay.
And so when we met, the first time, like, that was it's almost set a or it did set a certain level of expectation, or a certain, it impacted our relationship moving on. You know what I mean? So when our kids, or even us, like when we're exposed to something for the first time, like, it's going to carry a certain weight in our hearts and our minds, and in all capacities of life. But it's so when our kids, or for me, when our kids ask questions that's like uncomfortable, which I kind of, I'm a little weird, because I kind of like conflict in that thing, like talking about horror things. So I remember, like, all my
Yeah.
in-laws, they were younger. I remember taking them and talking about porn, and them being like, oh, okay, because, like, I just felt like, where their parents were, like, they were going through their own thing, so I knew that they were coming to age. So I was like, okay, like, I don't think they'll be able to talk about that right now, and knowing their personality. So, like, I took it up on myself as big brother-in-law, like, hey, like, let's talk about this. Like, this is what porn does to your brain, or this is what, it was an uncomfortable situation, but it was uh for the most part, it was my attempt to try to catch it before they were exposed to it on their own,
Yeah.
and before they got into this thing of where they felt alone. And if all else fails, what happens is, when we address those hard conversations, or when we address those things for the first time, somewhere, or I would like to believe, somewhere in their lifetime, they'll remember, oh, he talked to me about that, and that is what
Yeah.
this is. Or they'll have a different perspective than when somebody else is trying to tell them something different. And so now they'll be able to have the privilege of choosing what to believe, or even creating their own, from multiple perspectives. And so it's that open intentional, like, answering those questions and going as deep as they want, but not shying away, and creating those safe places for them to be able to open up with that.
Yeah. I think it's super important. I think that, like, being able to really, and this is where I think a skill needs to be developed, is having those conversations without shame or judgment attached.
Yeah.
I have my belief structure. I have the things that I think are
Mm-hmm.
acceptable and not acceptable, but those are for me, and that's
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of those structures are based on my relationship with God and the agreement that He and I have
Yeah.
that this is what I'm supposed to do. But if you're not a Jesus follower, if you haven't made those agreements, then I don't get to tell
Mm-hmm.
you what's acceptable or unacceptable for you.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of times what happens is we have these conversations with our kids, or as adults, parents, we don't have these conversations with our kids. And then our kids witness us judging and shaming and mocking
Mm-hmm.
other people.
Yes.
So then if your kid finds out that, like, oh, I have a tendency to like this thing or be wanting to do this thing, but my dad is always making fun of that person or always
Mm-hmm.
shaming that behavior, I'm never going to come talk to you about it,
Yeah.
right? So one of the things that I really like about like the intentional parenting and sort of like developing that emotional intelligence is the ability to for parents to be able to talk to their children in like as close to a shame-free environment as possible,
Yeah.
right? In a way that they
Yeah.
can say, this isn't really good for me. Because like even with our kids, like they'll come to us about different religions or different lifestyles and ask us. And I always try to tell them, like, well, here's what I understand, here's what I think and feel, and here's
Mm,
what some other people think and feel,
yeah.
and here's kind of what God says about it.
Yeah.
You come to your own, you figure out what you feel about it, because I don't want to force my opinion on you. And what I see a lot of times happening is the default, right? Is just,
Yep.
well, this is what dad like I'm a Republican, so you'll be a Republican, and then your kids will be a Republican, and then when there's a
Mm-hmm.
division, like, oh shit, what do we
Yep.
do?
Yep.
How do we move past this? Because we've never developed the ability to talk about, and I think that's what's happening with adults right now. Like our whole society is has kind of lost the ability to go, man, that's a crazy idea. But
Yeah.
okay. It's like instead we're like, that's a crazy idea, and you're an idiot for thinking that. Like,
Yeah. And I think, when we don't do things with love as the primary purpose, then that happens. It's that judgment, that shame, that condemnation to other people or even to ourselves, like that's allowed to flourish when we don't do things based in love. And
yep,
so kind of back to the, creating that culture, one of the things, and parenting the way that God parents, God loves you no matter what, whether you believe in him, whether you believe his name is this or that, or you don't want anything to do with him, or you hate him. He still loves you. So when we parent with that approach, obviously, we may, because of our belief system and because people, we are our beliefs, we may want them to respond a certain way, but like at the end of the day, it's about love. And so creating that space for them to have those different opinions or those different thoughts or ask those questions helps kind of develop them into thinking and processing certain things. And then for faith-based or believers, what happens is, like, they actually develop this belief system. I've talked to so many just people in general that they found out later on in life that their beliefs weren't actually their beliefs. It was manipulation.
yep,
It was manipulation from their parents, from their religious, things or
yeah,
whatever, that really kind of like rubbed off on them. So now they get to this place where they're like, you know what, like I never did believe that. Because why? Because internally, like, it was never developed from the inside out. It was just oppressed upon them. And
yeah,
oppression, injustice anywhere, like it'll eventually come out, it'll come to head. But when we do those things and we create that space of love and say, hey, like, this is like exactly what you were saying, like just kind of talking like, okay, this is what I think, this is what I feel, this is what I, when I read scripture, like this is what like God is saying, or what God has spoken to me specifically and showed me. And this is kind of like the culture, and this is the distinction. When we take that time and talk with them in love, and we don't like just, oh, you shouldn't be thinking that, or you shouldn't question God, or you
yeah,
shouldn't do these things, like they start to develop. And even us as well, like when we approach ourselves and attack let's just say you have that negative habit that you do not like, when you come to yourself and love, you're like, know what, like I love me, like God loves me, so like I'm worthy of love. Then you can move past that point and say, okay, like that's, that's why I think that, or I do believe that, and you get to decide when you created that space or that environment, that atmosphere of that unconditional, like, what, I'm going to love you regardless of your decisions, but you're your own person, so this decision might lead you to XYZ, but my job is to love you. And as a parent, if I'm talking to my child, like, it's like I'm here to like guide you. So hey, like we may not do that, but let's press through it. In a couple years from now, if you still want to do that, then let's bring it back to
Yeah.
the table. You could talk
Yeah.
to me about that.
Yeah. One of my favorite pastors says, no for now, but not necessarily forever. Like
That's good.
we're just not doing that right now.
Yeah,
And we'll
that's
see
really
what
good.
happens. Yeah. And so I like that. It helps almost like diffuse the victim mentality, right? Like it's not like you're like being a tyrant. You're just saying like, hey, this in this season, in this moment, we're not gonna do that.
Yeah,
That could be next week, could be next month, could be a
yeah.
couple years. I love it, man. I am so grateful to have your friendship and to know you and your family. And this conversation's been awesome. I think what I'm pulling from this the most is like really just, love first,
Mm,
talk a lot, ask a lot of questions. And it really, a lot of it comes back to me for like open-mindedness. Like
yeah.
open. We can set boundaries and we can have discernment. We can have guardrails in our lives that like this is where I feel like I'm best served, but not pushing that or forcing that on other people, especially like
That's
with
good.
kids. And I really hope that people listening to this are left encouraged that they know that like, they can in small amounts. Cause honestly, man, like I know you got two boys and two girls. I got mostly girls. And it took me a while to recognize like the impact that my words have on my daughters. Because I look in the mirror
Yeah.
and think I'm an idiot. I'm like, I don't know anything. Whatever I say is like in one ear and out the other. But I have
Mm-hmm.
learned over time that like I have to be careful with what I say to my girls because the smallest amount of undivided attention and interaction has a tremendous amount of impact on them. So even if you are working a
Mm-hmm.
full-time job, even if you are busy, 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 you can set aside time with your children and make them a priority. And like I asked this question the other
Yeah.
day, how many of us schedule time with our kids? Like we put everything else on the
Mm,
schedule. I got to go to work. I got to go to church. I got to go to this event. I got to go to that event. I have my to-do list. And I was like, how many of us have spend time with child on our to-do list? Like it's
yeah.
almost like we don't consider it because they're always around. But just because
Yeah.
they're around doesn't mean that we're with them.
Yep.
And so I think hopefully what you and I have talked about, what you shared, will inspire some people to get more intentional.
Yeah.
And and you guys have a group. It's Instagram. What's the Instagram and the Facebook and it's a paid group, right? Like they can join it and
Yeah. They Allie and Pat, Allie ALLIE, and just the word and Pat.com. They can find, like, that's where we're putting a lot of our energy, as far as like creating this space, which for people to engage and just have a one of the things that we found out is, it does take a village to raise a family. uh and we're just creating that space for people who want to be intentional in building a family and building themselves, um to come and just get these hacks, communicate with other people that's on the same mission, on the
yeah,
same kind of like goal of this intentionality. Which one thing I want to go back real quick, mainly for like the listeners, is because you can impact your kids. If you have a heart, good parent, you want to impact your kids. You can impact your kids like by your thoughts. Like energy is everything, and so the way that you may be working uh ungodly amount of hours just providing, and that's just your lifestyle, what your lifestyle requires of you right now. But you can still, when you take the time to dig deep and like get over those traumas, those triggers, those different things like that, what happens is you actually and see yourself the way that God sees you, like just in love, that God loves you unconditionally. What happens is that will most likely, or it'll be a huge part in impacting your kids way more than your words would ever in that season. And so that's why we start with the parent, the individual. We have some people in our group, that they're not single. I mean, they're not married or kids or anything like that. They want that intentionality. And
Yeah,
so
that's
it's a
awesome.
group for anybody that just wants to be intentional in building in a holistic manner with other people. And
Yeah,
so, yeah,
it's so good, man. I think it's a really important thing that people have access to, and I know some people are listening going, I wish I would have done this sooner. And I can testify that it doesn't matter when you start, you just got to start.
hmm,
Because our first two kids, and then like you kind of shared a little bit, you guys kind of turned the corner way faster than Carrie and I did, but you still have impact, right? Like you still
hmm,
impact your kids. And regardless of where you're at on that journey with your kids, you can shift gears and you can start to be more intentional right now. And
yeah,
so I would just invite people to go to allieandpat.com, check it out, see what
yeah,
these guys are doing. I think it's super important work. And I'm super grateful that we had the opportunity and the time, especially on short notice, to have this conversation and to share with people. And hopefully, in a little bit of time we can do this again and we can
yeah. Just let
revisit
me
some of the
know.
things you guys are doing. So appreciate it, man.
Absolutely, sir. Yep, yep.
Cool. Awesome, man.